So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are still doing our class in regards to Surah Nisa still. So, we haven't gone far, but Alhamdulillah, we definitely have passed a lot. And right now, we are on page 93. And certainly when we're looking at page 93, we yesterday had done وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ أَن يَقْتُلَ مُؤْمِنًا إِلَّا خَطَأً, but before that, we actually talked about a revision in terms of we're still within the munafiqeen area, so that's why we basically went within explaining the ayat that relate to the munafiqeen, and certainly we then went into details in regards to the ayah in terms of the deliberate or intentional killing and the unintentional killing, or at least the pseudo-intentional killing, and which is shibh al-amd. And we also talked about the killing by mistake. So we went in some details, and to make the story short, we basically said the story behind this, and it was Aysha ibn Abi Rabi'a, in where he had basically killed the person that tortured him during Jahiliyyah, not knowing that he had actually become Muslim. So that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the ayah, and it was certainly a really sad story. And the expiation for that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ قَتَلَ مُؤْمِنًا خَطَأً فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. And whoever kills a believer by mistake, then what they have to compensate that into, number one, first they would have to free a believing slave. And we said that that is to compensate, of course, the attack on a believing soul. وَدِيَةٌ مُسَلَّمَةٌ إِلَى أَهْلِهِ, and certainly the diya, the blood money. And we went in detail in regards to the blood money, and we said that the blood money would be given to the person that was killed. In other words, the victim's family, unless they would, here we said donate, but we also said yasaddaqu, to mean that they would forgive. And we said that forgiving is basically another metaphor here, where it is put in the words of sadaqah. فَإِنْ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ عَدُوٍّ لَكُمْ, if they're basically part of the enemies. And we said that the enemies, or at least the disbelievers, are three different types. We said the first type is al-musta'min, and we said al-mu'ahid, and we also said al-dhimmi. So here, qawmin aduwwun lakum, so that would basically be the person that is either al-mu'ahid or al-musta'min, but al-musta'min would be the one to be represented within aduwwun lakum. So here we go. If they are musta'min, basically entered with a visa, but coming from a country that is considered an enemy country. But they came, of course, and the country, the Muslim country, was basically giving them, let's call it a promise, or at least a political pass. And in that situation, if this person is killed, then the believer, that is the Muslim citizen in that situation, would basically have to do that freeing the slave. And scholars went into differences of opinions. What about giving the diya on behalf of the person that was killed, the victim? And we said the details is that the first group of scholars, they said yes, they would still get the diya, simply because this is a civilian right here and not necessarily a combatant. Therefore, considered that they should get that diya as a compensation for the assault against their own family member. The other group of scholars, they said this should not be including a diya, because this would be giving them money, and they treated this as, well, it's like giving your own enemy money and they might use it against you. So that was the second group of scholars' opinion. Yet for the other group, which is وَإِنْ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُمْ مِيثَاقٌ, if this person that was killed basically is not Muslim, but there was an agreement. So we're talking about an agreement in where there is, number one, there is a mu'ahada, and number two, there is al-dhimmi. So a person that is a mu'ahid would basically be a person that belongs to a country in where that country is in, let's call it in truce, let's call it in a situation where they've got some alliances together. And in that situation, that person would be called a mu'ahid. The person is a mu'ahid, all right? And the mu'ahada is basically the agreement itself, all right? And the second type is basically the dhimmi. A dhimmi would be the person that is not Muslim, a non-Muslim citizen, basically living within the Muslim country. So in that situation, if that person was killed, then they would get a diya. They would get a diya. They would get the blood money. And of course, we went in details, a little bit of some details in regards to diya and what that would look like. And we said that the diya from one diya to the other would really be different. So if we're talking about intentional killing, we said it would be a diya mughallada, the strongest amount of diya, in where, yes, it's 100 camels, but then the type of camels and the details of whether it's jada'a, whether it's laboon, all of those, or whether it's a 9-year-old camel, or whether it's a pregnant camel, or whether it's a 2-year-old camel, etc. All of those would basically differ in prices. So then there would be a certain number of how much of that would each and every single kind would be. In other words, so the real value of these 100 camels in the situation of intentional killing would definitely be the highest value, and it is to be paid upfront in situations of qatl al-khata, to mean by mistake, or even shibh al-amd. The details would be different, where yes, it's 100 camels, but the actual value and the actual details of what is inside and what is included in the 100 camel numbering is basically of a lesser value, even though there are 100 camels, but it's a different value technically. And certainly we're speaking about the value here, and even it doesn't have to be that, yeah, I'm going to be shipping 100 camels to the people, somebody that I killed in the US. You're not going to do that. We're actually going to be giving you the value of it in money. So if we're talking about a people that probably would prefer, or maybe what they use is not camels, but what they use is sheep, then we would go with sheep. If these people basically use cash instead, then we would give them the compensation of cash, which would be equivalent to the actual number that we had in terms of the number of diya. So that was to explain it. So we're not going to be shipping 100 camels to, this person that probably lives in the US or Russia, because of course their camels, number one, become useless, and they certainly don't even know how to take care of them. Okay, so, and therefore it becomes really not of any value. All right, so we also talked about the diya for a person that is not a Muslim. So a person that is not a Muslim, we basically talked about the differences of opinions between scholars, whether they would get 100 camels, or whether they would get less, or how much really would that be. We just kind of went over it really quick. فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ, and of course there's also the piece in where تحرير رقبة مؤمنة, to free a believing slave, and whoever cannot find a believing slave, then in that situation it would basically fast 2 months in a row. Fasting 2 months in a row where they cannot skip a day. If they skip a day, then they would have to do their 2 months over. And when we speak about not skipping a day for a reason, so let's say a person had to skip a day because they got sick or because the woman had her period, then in that situation, they cannot fast that day. In fact, they are obligated, if she's basically on her period, obligated not to fast. So this would not be included in completing the consecutive days. So there, when we're looking at mutatabi'ain, would mean consecutive. Tawbatan min Allah would be basically in order to help the person remove all the contamination that resulted in their hearts as a result of that grave sin, that major sin that they had committed, which is killing a person that is innocent. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا وَمَنْ يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ جهنم خالدا فيها وغضب الله عليه. Now, one thing, I was going over some of the notes. Yeah, I would go over the notes. Even after I finished the class, I would go over the notes and see, did I miss something that I was supposed to be talking about? So I would go over the notes and go over two notes. One note is basically the notes that I had given. And then the second notes are basically the new notes in where the new class. So it takes a lot of time. All right, let's see. I was going over the notes and I forgot to say one thing. You could see we just finished. I'm going to show you what we had done. So today marks the day where we had actually finished the 6th volume from Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Tafsir al-Qurtubi is 21 volumes. We just finished number 6. So that's our reference. And that's why I prepared number 7. Yes, we went over each and every single volume. Most of the times I do go over each and every single information. Sometimes I would skip things, but I would still read it, of course, but I would skip it because it's going to be too detailed and too advanced for most of the listeners, so I would just skip it. But most of the information on here, we would basically go over it and explain the most important pieces of it. All right, let's see in where the piece that I actually wanted to mention was the part about وَمَنْ يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا. And there was actually a story. So here we go. Number 6 was actually finished. It was supposed to be on volume number 7. Let's go over on volume number 7. Here we go. So volume number 7, you could see that this ayah, وَمَنْ يَقْتُلْ وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ أَنْ يَقْتُلَ مُؤْمِنًا إِلَّا خَطَأً. We just, hold on. Let's skip that one because we're going to be going to the page where we're going to, you could see it right there, ayah 92. It helps you actually know where you're at. Let's go right there. Okay, here we go. Some of the things that we had missed out. Some scholars had actually mentioned that the reason for the revelation for the ayah, let's look at that ayah so you could actually see it, that the reason for some of the revelation for part of this ayah is this story. And this story is actually in Sahih Muslim. I didn't mention it yesterday. It skipped me. All right. قال بعثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في سرية. Usama ibn Zayd, that is, he said the Prophet ﷺ had sent us on so a Sariya would be a battle, but the Prophet ﷺ was not within the army, so that would be a Sariya. So it's usually a small group of people. فَصَبَّحْنَا الْحُرَقَاتِ مِنْ جُهَيْنَا. What did they do? So early morning, it seems Juhayna was basically in an act of war. They were somehow, this is not a preemptive war, but Juhayna was definitely here being the combatants here to somehow attack the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ sent this Sariya, but here's what happened. They went early in the morning and then they attacked the tribe of Juhayna. But he came across a man that said, La ilaha illallah. This man, when certainly he saw that the army, the Muslim army was coming in, he said, La ilaha illallah. But despite that, he basically stabbed him. And he said, something in my heart didn't feel right about this. So he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ said, did he say La ilaha illallah and you still killed him? And he said, and well, basically he said, But, oh, Prophet of Allah, he just said that because he was afraid of basically the weapon. And he said, did you actually open up his belly to see what's in his heart so that you would know whether he actually meant it or not? And then the Prophet ﷺ, so in another story in where he actually said, so if I would open up his belly, would I know if he actually meant it? And the Prophet ﷺ said, no. But if you didn't even take what he had said, are you really going to basically find anything in his belly? In other words, why would you do such a thing? The Prophet ﷺ was definitely very angry, and the Prophet ﷺ, yet though the Prophet ﷺ did not rule that he was to be killed, that is here in that this man that committed this, he was not basically executed or at least sent for a capital punishment or even asked to give the diya. And of course, the reason that scholars would give out on this is, number one, in where he didn't do it to do an assault, but it was basically, I guess, a misinformation on his behalf, but certainly that was considered not acceptable by the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ basically dismissed, I guess, of course, the execution or at least al-qasas for this combatant because of the mistake where he didn't know what the ruling was, he didn't know what to do, and he basically had interpreted things differently. He misinterpreted the whole situation, didn't know what to do, and of course he also had come right there confessing about his mistake, confessing about the mistake that he had done, and didn't necessarily need to investigate the situation. No, he came and confessed about it. So obviously he was not doing it to do some kind of a war crime, some kind of an assault, but he basically thought that it was a case of war and that this person was basically a combatant in that situation. And certainly he was a combatant, but he basically said, La ilaha illallah. So it was really completely clueless for Usama in that situation. Usama, of course, that's Usama ibn Zayd. The other piece, I think, وَإِن كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُمْ مِيثَاقٌ, we talked about al-mu'ahad, and we also talked about it about al-mu'ahad, in where we're speaking here, not intentional killing. So when we're speaking about بَيْنَهُمْ مِيثَاقٌ, this is in a situation of the killing by mistake. So it was unintentional killing, and certainly this is not something that the person had intended. It was by mistake, but even if the person is not a Muslim, they would still have their life but basically in sanctity. So this is basically because the sanctuary of a human life, even if they are not Muslim, unless they're an enemy, that would still be a different story if they are combatants. But so wanted to mention this piece of it. The other thing about women's diya, I know that some sisters, they had contacted me in private and said, well, wait a minute. There are some scholars that disagreed and said that a woman's diya is the same as the man's diya, etc. Now, one thing I would like to say is that when we're speaking about fiqh, okay, and the objection that some modern scholars had noted that there is no hadith in regards to the diya, in regards to the woman's diya being half the man's diya, but of course we would see that there is an ijma'. So al-ijma' unanimously agreed upon between scholars. So the unanimous agreement would actually act if we're talking about a group of Sahaba, which there was a huge number of Sahaba. There were some Sahaba. Yesterday we actually pointed it out. Let me just make sure that you would see that. Yesterday we pointed it out, and we basically went in the details, and we said, let's see, and we did it yesterday, in where we talked about diyat al-mar'a and basically put out all the different, here we go, we went to this website. You're all able to see it, right? I wanted you to see it. And they did a good job and did a good job right there. So I want you to see it. So yes, you do have this hadith. Oh, hold on. Okay, here we go. So certainly you do actually have the different scholars. So we're looking at a Shafi'i, that's 205 Hijriya, and he basically had said that there was no one to object to that a woman's diya is half. I want you to look at the number in here. So the Prophet ﷺ dies 11-year Hijriya, even though, yes, it's not like we're here trying to prove that a woman's diya is half just for the sake. I think that what's more important than how much of a woman's diya is really the whole idea of usul al-fiqh, the whole idea of how do we actually base our Islamic understanding based on evidence. That's the point that I care about here, more than the diya and how much is it. Because anyways, hey, we don't even have any Islamic governance for even something even more common that happens, let alone the diya of a woman. That's a rare thing. That's a rare crime, even in non-Muslim countries, where a woman is basically, we have more men killed than women killed, simply because, of course, in the situations that women are usually in are completely, I would say, less drama, and they're definitely in less intense situations. So anyhow, but what I wanted to get to was the most important thing is how to understand the evidences, how to go back to building a foundation of Islamic thought, how to bring about the vision based on evidences. So I want you to remember the Prophet ﷺ died 11-year Hijrah. I want you to look at those numbers. If you're looking at Imam Shafi'i, who died 205 Hijriya, and also said, I do not know any scholar, not in the past and not during his time, who actually said other than that the woman's diya is half the man's diya. All right. Let's see. al-Badri was actually even before that, I believe 195-year Hijriya, in where he said the same thing. You're looking at Ibn al-Mundhir, who's actually the most important scholar that combined in basically the differences on the different issues, that there was a unanimous agreement. Ibn Abdul Barr from the Malikis. Now you're talking about different scholars from different madhab. We're looking at a Shafi'i. Tabari has his own madhab. Ibn al-Mundhir, well, that's a Shafi'i right there. But Ibn Abdul Barr, Maliki, he also said that scholars had unanimously agreed that the woman's diya is half the man's diya. Let's look at here. Ibn Qudama. Yes, certainly he actually died in the 6th century or the 6th century Hijriya, but he was from the Madhab Hanbali. He also had said that this is the same. The only two that had said otherwise are basically Ibn Ulayya and Al-Asam, that they actually had said that it is equal to the man's diya. So basically only these two scholars. And you could see right there that you saw that the Sahaba themselves had actually unanimously agreed upon that. We're going to talk about the evidences that they had laid out. Is-Sarakhsi is basically Hanafi madhab. He also said the same thing, and you could see he died 483-year Hijriya. We're just going to go over it really quick right there. Ibn Rushd, Maliki as well, Qurtubi, Maliki as well. Here's the evidence. So this is called, I want you to look at this one right there. This is the point. There are two kinds. Pay attention to this one. When you look at al-hadith, okay, you look at al-hadith, there are different kinds of hadith in how we look at it. Number one is that there are some ahadith in where when you look at the definition of hadith, anything that the Prophet ﷺ, min qawl, aw fi'l, or taqreer, or sifa, anything that was mentioned upon the Prophet ﷺ from words, reports, or even an action, or basically a taqreer min qawl aw fi'l aw taqreer aw sifa, or even a description about the Prophet ﷺ. When we talk about a report, there are different details of how we make a report. A report can be in where it is directly saying the Prophet ﷺ had ordered us not to do such and such. The Prophet ﷺ had ordered us to do such and such. I saw the Prophet ﷺ doing such and such, and so forth. Now, when you look at certain actions or certain, let's call it legal things, legal orders, it doesn't always have to be in where it is in a statement of a commandment. Sometimes the practice itself could actually act as a taqrir, in where when you look at a taqrir, there are two kinds. There's a taqrir in where it is mawquf and marfu'. Pay attention to this one. This is really important. When you say taqrir mawquf, would actually mean I've got here a report, but I'm not sure whether the report was really based on the Sahabi himself's basically explanation. So that would be a mawquf, or whether that this type of information, they didn't say it just out of their own selves, but it would really be coming and tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ. And this is what would be called al-marfu'. So when we see a ruling that basically talks about a woman's diya, for example, this is not a personal opinion, then in that situation, what was considered as authentic based on, number one, we see that Umar ibn al-Khattab, there was a narration on Umar ibn al-Khattab. Let's see it. And here we go. We see it was in Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba. And this Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba is actually considered the most important reference that was focused and simply specialized just in gathering the different what are called athar. Athar are different than ahadith. In ahadith are the reports that the Prophet ﷺ had said, but in athar are the reports that the companions or the tabi'een had said. So when you look at that, basically, can we go over those athar and see whether the chain of narration is authentic or not? You certainly can. You certainly can. The same exact way that we would do with the hadith, we would do for the athar as well. Let's hear Uthman, and where, yes, he mentioned al-istidhkar, and when we would look at Ali ibn Abi Talib, Musannaf Abdul Razzaq and Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba would basically be the two most important references to give us al-athar. And you could see right there that the scholars going over it, and in the end is that just wanted to mention we've got Umar ibn Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and all of those are Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, Ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit. All of those, they're basically Sahaba that had mentioned that the diya for a woman is half. So the modern scholars like al-Qaddawi and other modern scholars, when they had said that no, it's equal, and they basically depended on the general statements of the generalized ahadith, then in that situation, we would basically consider that this is a reference that acts as a hadith. This reference acts as a hadith in that situation, as the hadith, basically as the words that are marfu'ah. They didn't have this kind of an agreement on it simply because it was something that they agreed upon in a closed circle, but it was really going back to the information that traces back to the Prophet ﷺ. So that's where it's coming from. All right. Some of the modern scholars that said that it's equal, etc., and they said we've got no evidence. They basically had regarded that the hadith, which is in al-Bayhaqi, that it's not an authentic hadith. And in that situation, when we look at it could be that we can have a not authentic hadith at times, but do we necessarily regard that as evidence or not? It depends on the level of a weakness in that hadith. So we have over 69 different levels of weak ahadith. So when we're looking at a weak hadith, 69 different levels. And this is extremely important. When we're looking at 69 different levels,
That's a lot. Subhanallah.
And the reason why there's that classification is really to help us know when and before we would jump. And of course, that was Ibn Salah was the most important, Ibn Salah, and also, well, in his Tadrib al-Rawi, and also Suyuti as well, in where the classifications of different types of ahadith da'ifa, not because a hadith is classified as da'if or poor or not authentic, it doesn't mean that we don't take it as a reference. It actually would be important for us to look at the type of weakness there is in it. Because some weak ahadith, we might actually take it as a reference, even though it's weak. Yes, even though it's weak, because of the type of weakness. When do we actually reject? What's the most important way to reject the hadith if it's weak? If we know that there is a narrator that is a liar, if we know that there is a narrator, for example, that was known to making up information, that was known to fabricate information, etc., then we're going to reject that hadith without even second guessing, second thinking, or even being hesitant about it. But if we're looking at some ahadith in where, well, we do have what is called the al-an'ana, which basically is a type of weak ahadith, but that they're basically scholars, but some of those scholars, when they were narrating the hadith, those scholars were great scholars, outstanding scholars. They were good in their deen, they were good in their memory, they were good in the reporting, etc. But some of these scholars, they didn't always mention the way that they had the transmitted hadith, how they transmitted the hadith and how the transmission happened. So they will generally use the word an to mean upon. So I would say, for example, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, for example, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say that this information, piece of information, all right? But then what they said, that not that they had heard, but they actually said, upon makhul and upon the, let's say, Qa'nabi, upon, mentioned the different scholars, the different chains, but didn't really say exactly whether makhul heard it from that scholar, the other previous scholar, or whether he had somehow received the information from a third party or whatever it is. So that would be something that is considered a non-authentic hadith. But then when we know that the chain of narrators within that hadith are basically considered as scholars, and we know that this is not a chain where anybody is a liar, but those are actually chain of scholars that are basically not giving us exactly how that information was transmitted, but they just said, well, upon fulan, and this is how I got the information. All right, this is an example of a hadith da'if. Are you going to take it? Are you going to reject it? Then we're looking at the information in where before we would jump on the wagon and say, but no, we can't. In order for me to regard something as fair or not fair, it's important to regard the other pieces of information. That's number one. Number two, as a Muslim, you're basically going to go back to the evidences in the Quran and Sunnah to help you recognize what's fair and what's not fair. So we would basically rule if something is fair or not based on what with the influences of our probably modern or Western or liberal or feminist or whatever it is, views on what makes justice. We would have to go back to the Quran and Sunnah and remember how Ibn al-Arabi had said about Abu Hanifa. He said, as for Abu Hanifa, he made the Quran be the lens that he sees through, and he was capable of seeing the truth. He was capable of seeing justice. And this is important. In order for us to regard something as justice or not justice, then in that situation, look through the lens of Quran and Sunnah, or at least the evidences that you have. What if somebody says, sorry, I'm still not convinced. Thank you so much for laying all that out, but I'm still not convinced. And I still feel that the general statement in the ayah that if you kill the soul, then, and of course, we're not here talking about killing in intentional killing. No, if a man kills and deliberately kills a woman, deliberately goes and commits that assault, yes, basically the result, or at least the punishment, is definitely going to be al-qasas. You killed the woman and it was intentional killing. The result is going to be you two are going to face capital punishment. Simple as that. Even though she's a woman, absolutely, her life is of value. A woman's life is of an equal value to a man's life. A woman's life is an equal value because it's a nafs for nafs. Now, the diya is not whatsoever as the price for somebody's life. It's for the compensation of the assault and not whatsoever the value of a person's life. Because the Prophet ﷺ had regarded that the human life is even more sanctuary than the sanctity of al-Kaaba itself. The human life is more sanctuary than the sanctity of al-Kaaba itself. The Kaaba itself. Yes. And that's why when we talk about that, whether we're talking about a child or whether we're talking about an adult, or whether an adult man or adult woman, okay, but the diya is to compensate for the loss and not necessarily for the life value whatsoever. All right, but again, what if the person says, okay, I know, I understand you're saying by unintentional killing, you laid out all those evidences, but I'm still not convinced. I really think that the scholars that said that a woman's diya is not half, and I really think that the evidences were not proven unauthentic, and therefore leaving it to the general ruling that a human life and its sanctity is basically deserving equal compensation. And would that get the person out of the fold of Islam? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They didn't say something that is directly against the Quran and Sunnah. They just they don't feel that they have the evidences. So that doesn't get them out of the fold of Islam. And certainly they wanted to basically base it on the Quran, based on the general statements in the Quran. That's absolutely fine. And this is basically an opinion that modern scholars, and even like you said, like we said earlier, Ibn Ulayya and al-Asam, also scholars, although their opinion, I don't feel that it has strong evidence to support it. But at the end of the day, is that you could see that some scholars had adopted, even modern scholars had adopted that opinion. So here we go. All right, let's continue. The other story that I did not talk about yesterday is, let's talk about it right there, in where I'm just going to go over some of the things that I had missed out on. Go ahead, Ebyan. Go ahead, Ebyan.
Salam alaikum. I had a question about you said, sorry, I took a picture. تقرير موقوف. No.
Okay. So
Yeah,
basically,
I wanted to, like, can you elaborate that one much? And also marfu'.
Okay, let me explain that one. I'm going to write it down and explain it. Okay, so what is a hadith? Hadith was anything that was mentioned upon the Prophet ﷺ. ما صدر عن الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. Maybe I can write it down. ما صدر عن الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. All right, من قول أو فعل أو تقرير أو صفة. Okay, so anything that was mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, whether we have a statement that he had said, a quote, or whether it was basically a fi'l, an action. The Prophet ﷺ stood and said, pray as you see me pray. Here's a fi'l. What do we got? He stood up, he went, he washed his hands, he got up and prayed, he looked around, etc. This is the fi'l. القول, he said, صلوا كما رأيتموني أصلي. Pray as you see me pray. Here's a quote. تقرير, in where the Sahaba had said the Prophet ﷺ had forbid that we would eat donkey's meat. Here we go. Here's taqrir. Sifa, the Prophet ﷺ was ablaj. The Prophet ﷺ was the description of the Prophet ﷺ. He basically did not have a unibrow. He had wide eyes. He had very beautiful fixed eyebrows, etc. That's a sifa. Okay, that's a description. Now, this is for the hadith. The other, so this is a hadith basically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. There's al-athar. Al-athar would be something that the Sahaba themselves had said. So it was a quote that was attributed to the Sahaba, to the Prophet's companions. What did they say? How did they report? What did they report? What did they say? Now, such reports, not every single companion's report, we would just take it and say, well, here it is. We have this report, and therefore that's enough. I've got a Sahabi that said that makes Islam. Not quite too fast. We would look at the information that was said. We need to know whether that information that was said, whether it is in the statement as mawquf or marfu. What does that mean? We're going to look at the information. Does that really see that it is representing his opinion, his statement, his interpretation for the case or that information? Or is that really reflecting that he got this information not based on his own interpretation, but really based upon the Prophet? Let's give an example. When you're looking at information that speaks about, let's say, what's going to happen towards the end of times. Okay, like Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman said, towards the end of times, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 events happening. Well, Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, such information, there's no way that such information, he was basically giving it in order to represent his interpretation to the situation, because he doesn't have any information in regard to the future. And certainly he didn't have any revelation. So if he was talking about an information about the fitan, the future things that were going to happen, we would basically put that within the category that he must have gotten it from the Prophet ﷺ, and this is more looking like marfu', more looking like it is an information that is to be attributed and tracing back. Let's use that word, tracing back to the Prophet himself, not tracing back to his personal stance and his personal opinion. So al-mawquf would be something that would trace back to his personal opinion, personal stance, and al-marfu' would be that it basically is not a personal stance, but it would trace back to the Prophet. Did I explain that, dear?
Yes, barakallah feek.
All right, good. Okay, let's continue. Now, of course, we're just going to jump really quick to the ayah that we were doing, and we had the other question that the other sister had asked is the part do they actually have their repentance accepted or not? Although yesterday I thought I had explained it, but I wanted to explain one thing, is that number one, when you're looking at Sahih, the hadith that we had mentioned about Ibn Abbas, in where Sa'id ibn Jubayr goes to Abdullah ibn Abbas and really wanted to see whether the person that killed somebody, whether they do have a tawbah or not. And we mentioned that the story that Abdullah ibn Abbas, a guy comes in and asks him whether there is tawbah, and then he basically says no for the first questioner, and then another guy comes in, asks him if there is a repentance to be accepted for a killer, and then he says yes, and both situations, of course, contradictory. It's a contradictory answer, but you gave the exact complete opposite to both questioners. And of course, then in that situation, Abdullah ibn Abbas explains that the first one obviously had come with a lot of anger appearing on his face, in where he wanted to see if he were to commit the crime and the assault on, whether he can just commit the crime and then probably just seek tawbah and get it over with. And that way, hey, I've got a tawbah and we're all done. So he said the first one was obviously coming with a different intention, and therefore it was to really give him that I guess retraction to get him away from going forward with the crime. The second guy came in, obviously he seemed like he was feeling the guilt, he was in complete remorse, he was complete sorrow. And the general statement in, of course, the ayat is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's go back to that page in where it was on 374, that's the page that we opened up yesterday, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us in terms of in Surah al-Furqan right there, for those that do not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do not kill any soul that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid anyone to kill, and do not commit zina, and whoever is to do that, then they would be held accountable. They would be held accountable and basically considered at sin. And of course, you could see right there, this right there exception. This illa is to basically say that this is an exception, illa man taba wa amana wa amila salihan, except those that would repent, those that would do good. In other words, they would basically change their lifestyle and commit righteousness. Those are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would replace the bad deeds into good deeds. So this illa right there, this exception right there is basically an exception to the generalized statements in these ayat right there. This is a generalized statement, and therefore you could see this illa right there is taking us there. And of course, there are some, I'm going to take you, oh, la ilaha illallah, and I thought you guys could actually see it. Here we go. Here's the page that we're talking about. This is page 374 and 375. All right. لا يقتلون النفس التي حرم الله إلا بالحق. So this is basically the generalized statement. And of course, this ayah right there, إلا من تاب وآمن وعمل صالحا, is basically this illa is an exception. So the generalized statement in this ayah, this piece of the ayah is basically to bring about an exception in this generalized statement. So if they were to do good, then they would not be held accountable and they would be forgiven. Let's go back to this one in where you could see. So what was this ayah revealed for? This ayah was actually revealed for, I want you to look at this one. And this one is really rather disgusting. Let's look at it. So there's this guy, Miqyas ibn Subaba. Miqyas ibn Subaba, he became Muslim along with his brother Hisham ibn Subaba. But then the second day he found that Hisham was actually killed. Where? It was in the tribe of Bani Najjar. The tribe of Bani Najjar were in Medina. But he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, my brother was killed. So the Prophet ﷺ basically sent to the tribe of Bani Najjar to ask the tribe to investigate, I guess, to figure out who the killer was and all of that. They couldn't get any information, but instead, since they couldn't really get any information who the perpetrator was, so he then ordered them, well, compensate him and give him the diya for his brother. Who's going to be responsible for that? Basically, in Najjar, Bani Najjar, the tribe of Bani Najjar. You guys, he was found in your area. He was killed in your area. You couldn't find the perpetrator. Fair enough. You did your investigation, but that does not mean that he is not to be given the compensation for the death and the killing of his brother. So basically, he sent a guy from Bani Fihr to go to Bani Najjar and say, hey, we know that you don't know, basically. Bani Najjar, they said, we don't know the perpetrator. He said, yeah, we know that you don't know the perpetrator, but they said, we'll give the diya instead. So fair enough. They give him 100 camels, which is the diya, basically. And then basically the this guy from Bani Fihr and also Miqyas, he basically, of course, he can't take the 100 camels by himself. He really needed support. He needed help to take care of these 100 camels. So he basically goes with this guy from Bani Fihr, along with the 100 camels, which is basically the money, and goes all the way, goes back to Medina. But then Miqyas, what he does is he actually kills the guy from Bani Fihr. Why? Basically because he wanted to retaliate. But this guy from Bani Fihr had nothing to do with this. He was just helping you along. He was really just a guy that the Prophet ﷺ had sent to Bani Najjar to tell them, did you investigate? So he was really acting as an officer, no more. But he killed the guy and he took the 100 camels. And then he went to Mecca and he said this poem. He said, I killed the guy. قتلت به فهرا وحملت عقله صرات بني النجار أرباب فارعي حللت به وتري وأدركت ثؤرتي وكنت إلى الأوثان أول راجعي. So this is a poem in Arab, would basically say their poems in order to basically make their announcements. So he said, I killed the guy from Bani Fihr and I basically combined all the compensation to compensate for the death of my brother. And of course, because that they had Bani Najjar, they basically had committed the crime. So that way I took basically the compensation, and I even compensation for the death of my brother. I killed somebody instead of his killing. And I also had taken even the compensation, the money compensation, the diya, and then I went back to and I was the first one back to worshiping the idols, basically. Now here's the thing. The Prophet ﷺ had heard what had happened, and of course it became known what had happened. So the Prophet ﷺ then said that this man is going to get the punishment for the crime that he had committed. Now, once the Prophet ﷺ had entered Mecca in the 8th year Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ had ordered the capital punishment for this man for the crime that he had done. All right, so this is basically to explain this one. In other words, it's basically right there. You have done a crime, then therefore you're going to be responsible for the crime. You were given the compensation, but then you killed someone that has nothing to do with any of this. He was just really trying to help you. All right, so this is just one piece. Now, of course, when you look at the ayah, so a person that committed a crime, do they get their repentance accepted or not, even if it was as big and as dangerous as killing somebody? Yes, because the general statement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَقْبَلُ التَّوْبَةَ عَنْ عِبَادِهِ, and he is, you could see in Surah ayah number 25, that the Lord Almighty is the one that accepts the repentance basically from his servants. And this is a generalized statement. So a tawbah, that alif lam right there. Remember, there are two kinds of alif lam. There is that defining article, the definite article, alif lam, when I would say, give me the pencils. And when I say, give me the pencils, you understand each and every single pencil that everybody has in this room. But if I were to say, give me the pencil, you're like, which pencil are you talking about? And I would say, well, the pencil. You'd understand that probably the pencil that I was lastly talking about, maybe the pencil in your hand or whatever it is. So in that situation, we would talk about an exclusive al, or a particular al, or an inclusive al. And a particular al to mean, when we're speaking about a particular, I'm talking about one particularized al, which is called al-ahdiyya. And al could also be an istighraqiyya, to mean an inclusive, and every single sin that a person might commit would basically be included. If you were to repent, it would be included, part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may accept the tawbah for. Yet, you could see in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إن الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء. The ayah says in Surah Nisa that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept or forgive associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but accepts every other sin whomever He wills, which would actually mean the general statement in telling us that associating partners or shirk is not to be forgiven, but when we're talking about any other sin, it can be included in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive. So therefore, this generalized statement right there would basically tell us that yes, a person that basically would repent would be included, which was also included in Hadith Ubadah ibn Samit. Ubadah ibn Samit, his grave is right at the doors of Bab al-Asbat in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. I went there, and of course, Bab al-Asbat has two Sahabas buried there, Ubadah ibn Samit and Shaddad ibn Aus. Ubadah ibn Samit, he had basically said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, تبايعوني على أن لا تشركوا بالله شيئا ولا تزنوا ولا تسرقوا ولا تقتلوا النفس التي حرم الله إلا بالحق فمن وفى منكم فأجره على الله. So look at this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ basically had these Sahaba, and that was during al-Bay'ah, that they would, number one, pledge that they would not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would not commit adultery or fornication. They would not steal. They would not kill anybody except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as permissible to kill. And whoever is basically to be committed, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward them for it, for their commitment in not committing any of these basically sins. وَمَا أَصَابَ شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَعُوقِبَ بِهِ فَهُوَ كَفَّارَةٌ لَهُ. This is important. And whoever is to commit any of these sins, and then the Lord Almighty punished them for the sin that they had committed, then that would be acting as an expiation for the sin committed. And whoever وَمَنْ أَصَابَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ شَيْئًا فَسَتَرَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ فَأَمْرُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ إِنْ شَاءَ عَفَى عَنْهُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ عَذَّبَهُ. Whoever is to commit any of these sins, any of these assaults, basically, but the Lord Almighty hid it for them, in other words, didn't reveal it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to deal with it. Deal with it is not a statement, is not a metaphorical statement to mean a threat, but here, that's why the hadith goes on to explain it is upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to either forgive that person or punish them for the assault that they had committed. You can see this hadith is basically an authentic hadith narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. So in that situation, that tells us that it can happen that a person might commit any of these sins and still be forgiven. That's left for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to determine. All right, so this is just I guess we spent, okay, here we go. So someone might say, but there was someone that said that this is abrogated, that this ayah is abrogated. And the beautiful thing that Al-Qurtubi had said, because one scholar, he had basically said that this ayah is abrogated simply because I want you to see this one. I want you to look at it. He said, simply because this ayah, which basically is, let's say now we've got this ayah, they said this was later, this was sent before by 6 months. And they said, well, that other ayah that was sent 6 months after. Therefore, they said this means that it was abrogated. What does abrogated mean? Abrogated means that it was the ruling was canceled out, basically. The ruling was canceled out. And he said, here, Al-Qurtubi says, النسخ لا يدخل الأخبار. What are you talking about? You don't abrogate an information, but you abrogate a ruling. And abrogation only happens to rulings. It can happen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might send out a ruling and then, of course, send out later another ruling. Let's give an example. The beginning of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ had basically forbid that the Muslims would go to the graveyards. Why? Well, because they were basically taking graveyard visitation as a way of worship. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ forbid them. Once they went into the practice, into not regarding cemeteries and grave sites as a place to worship, then once they graduated from that, then the Prophet ﷺ said, I had forbid you from visiting the graves. Now visit it, because it's a way to remind you of the hereafter. It's the way to remind you of your purpose. It's a way to remind you of the most important thing that you were created for, basically your akhirah. So you could see that the Prophet ﷺ here in the beginning of Islam, early times of Islam, he basically gave a ruling and then later on gave a different ruling. Same thing when we're speaking about alcohol. In the early times of Islam, alcohol was permitted and Sahaba were drinking. Everybody was drinking, of course. And later on, it basically gave a certain rulings that you can only drink at night and not in the day. And then finally, a finalized statement was that you cannot drink completely. Stop drinking entirely. And in that situation, that basically goes into that abrogation. All right, whether it's a gradual thing or whether it's an abrogation where another ruling was canceled out. Abrogation does not happen to information, because an information is a fact and not a ruling. Okay, it's not a practice, it's a fact. So the fact doesn't change. The fact doesn't change simply because someone else had thought, well, this is contradictory. The fact is a fact, and this is a fact and does not change with time. It does not change with basically changing the situations. It's a fact. All right? It doesn't change. All right. So I can see sister had a question right there. Go ahead, my dear.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, can you go back to the page where the guy that got killed for like trying to investigate?
Yep, sure.
Of that.
Okay. Let's go back to it right there.
Okay, Jazakallah. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
That's it. Okay. I guess she just wanted to make a screenshot of it. That's okay.
Yeah.
That's all right. That's all right. All right. Let's continue. Yeah, now we're going to go back to that ayah right there. I'm going to say it. Okay. وَمَن يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمَ خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَلَعَنَهُ وَأَعَدَّ لَهُ عَذَابًا عَظِيمًا. We just did that ayah. Now going to continue. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فتبينوا ولا تقولوا لمن ألقى إليكم السلام لست مؤمنا تبتغون عرض الحياة الدنيا فعند الله مغانم كثيرة كذلك كنتم من قبل فمن الله عليكم فتبينوا إن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. Let's see, I'm going to give you the wrong translation, or at least the surface translation, and then we're going to go in details. O you who believe, if ضربتم في سبيل الله is a compound word and basically is to mean if you travel. إذا ضربتم في سبيل الله, if you travel or you go in jihad, basically, فتبينوا, then seek the information and do not, in other words, investigate, and do not say to those that had given you did I read ألقى إليكم السلام? Sorry, ألقى إليكم السلامة. Sorry about that. ولا تقول لمن ألقى إليكم السلام. Did I say السلام? I think I said السلام. ولا تقول لمن ألقى إليكم السلام لست مؤمنا. And do not say to those that had basically given you salam, giving you peace, or given you, is it shahada or is it istislam or is it submission? We're going to talk about that in detail because salam would really be more of salam would more be of submission, would more be salam peace, but we're going to go in detail. Lasta mu'mina. Don't tell them you're not a believer. Seeking تبتغون عرض الحياة الدنيا, where you're seeking just some ornaments of this life. For the Lord Almighty has all the maghanim, has all the compensation, has all the ornaments, and many, many ornaments. For you were like that before, then the Lord Almighty blessed you. So then, therefore, investigate, for the Lord Almighty is all-knowing of what you do. I want you to look at this one. There's so many details in this ayah, but let's see, of course, what clarifies these details is basically number one, when you're looking at إِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, ضَرَبَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ would not necessarily be just a generalized statement like that. ضَرَبَ can be a compound word. ضَرَبَ in itself means to strike. But ضَرَبَ فِي الْأَرْض is a compound word to mean traveled. ضَرَبَ in general just means to strike. Only if there is another addition that would actually give me a different meaning. Think of driveway. Think of basically parkway. Think of course, the way, with the word way is there, but just by saying parkway, that means something different than driveway. And the list goes on with all these compound words and how they basically would mean a certain thing. And certainly, okay, it does actually tell us that it's a pathway to something, but here, ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ simply means something similar. In where ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, it's a compound word, and in that the context, and in this compound way, it would basically mean that it is in al-jihad. This is al-jihad. So that's why he said, الضرب السير في الأرض. الضرب would basically mean when you're going, basically you're traveling on earth, but here this is basically speaking about jihad. So let's see what happened. There is a hadith I wanted to actually hear. He says, where the Prophet ﷺ quote, he says, لا يخرج الرجلان يضربان الغائط يتحدثان كاشفين عن فرجيهما فإن الله يمقت على ذلك. So you could see right there, يضربان الغائط. I'm going to explain this one. The Prophet ﷺ said, no two men basically striking al-gha'it. This is not talking about striking, and so this is a very wrong translation, but this is actually to mean that they are going to basically the bathrooms and that they would actually speak, both of them. So they were basically, at the time they didn't have bathrooms, certainly, but what they used to do, they would go to a faraway area, it doesn't have to be too far, and do their business in this faraway low area. So it would be kind of like a little hill, and they would go do their business there. But the Prophet ﷺ said, if you're basically going that area to do your natural business, it would be inappropriate basically where two men would basically speak to each other, where each and every single one is uncovering their private parts. He said, for the Lord Almighty dislikes that. So you could see here, يضربان الغائط, it does not whatsoever mean striking feces. Sorry, but this is extremely disgusting to say, but unfortunately, right now we have so many people that misunderstand Lugha Arabiya, and they would say, well, this is what it's saying. No. This is actually a compound word to mean using public bathrooms. Okay? Sorry about that, everybody, but I had to say it because right now we're getting a lot of people, we're getting somebody saying, bringing in all these different all these different misconceptions. So I had to make sure that nobody comes with this misconception and say, well, I'm here taking Arabi 101 class and I'm learning how to read Arabi and this is what it's saying. I'm like, okay, well, maybe you should go for Arabi 102 to understand that there's something called the compound word. And this doesn't mean to strike feces, but this is actually means to go to the public bathrooms. Okay, let's see. Sorry about that, everybody. I mean, we would get a lot of people actually coming in and bringing in these really funny misconceptions. And it's like, what? How did you get there? All right. Al-Bukhari had mentioned the story for this ayah. What is the story for this ayah? The story for the story for this ayah is that, let's say, al-Bukhari had revealed who's Ata ibn Abi Rabah, that Ibn Abbas, who was basically the Prophet's cousin, that Ibn Abbas said that there was a man who had ghunaymatillah. He basically had like a little sheep, a baby sheep or something. Then the Muslims had actually come to him, and then he said, Assalamu alaikum. But what they did was that they killed him and they even took his sheep. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed this ayah that this is not permissible. This is not a part of Islam. And this is important to actually say, is that the Prophet ﷺ was teaching them, you cannot go and attack people and start taking their stuff, or even if this person was basically not Muslim, you can't just attack their life and attack them like that and think that I'm doing jihad. So the Prophet ﷺ is basically teaching them what it means to act upon principle, what it means to act upon justice, and what it means to basically regard the human life as sanctuary. So one of them basically said, well, when he said as-salam, basically when he said assalamu alaikum, they said, let's look at this ayah. They said, well, when he said assalamu alaikum, they basically was not a believer. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was responding, what are you doing? It's like, are you here really? Are you here just going for this arad al-hayat al-dunya? What is arad al-hayat al-dunya? Arad al-hayat al-dunya, again, a compound word. The word arad can mean, depending on the context, the word arad can actually mean a display of something, al-ard, a display of something. Al-arad could also mean a piece of something, could also mean a side of something. Okay, so here, arad al-hayat al-dunya would basically mean something that is like a small piece, an aside of life, which is basically this baby sheep that he had. Like, you killed the guy for a baby sheep, and you killed the guy even though he said assalamu alaikum. But even though he basically greeted you, but you went and attacked him. Let's go for the other story, which most scholars actually say is more to what the story was really about and why this ayah was revealed. So this Muhallim ibn Jathama. Now, this one's really interesting. Okay, let's see. That the man that was mentioned and that was this ayah was referring to was Muhallim ibn Jathama, and the person that was killed was Amir ibn al-Adbat. That the Prophet ﷺ had basically because this man had basically killed basically Amir, all right, he killed him. And even though he had said La ilaha illallah, even though he had said that he was Muslim, but then after that he only lived for sab'an, who knows if it was 7 days or 7 years or 7 months, but then he was basically buried, and then every time he would be buried, the earth just pushes him out. Not pushes him out, it could be that, I guess, his body would come back to the surface somehow. And they said, well, for the second, thrice, and third time and all of that, but then at the end, they basically just had to take his body and just throw it anywhere. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna al-arda la taqbalu man huwa sharrun min. That the earth would basically would basically take and even embrace that is basically a burial, who's even worse than him. In other words, there's nothing
You know,
worse than
oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I heard a story. There was a sheikh who was saying that they tried to bury someone, and they were so like heavy and kind of similar to that. I don't know. I can't
Right.
remember every exact
We can
detail.
definitely, right. So we can definitely sometimes see some signs of a person's, we could use that as an amara, we could use that as some signs, but we cannot use that as evidence to prove whether somebody is good or not. Okay. So let's see the other side.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
No. Does that mean if they were trying to bury someone and the earth does not consume the person, what could that be? I'm just curious about what could that mean?
So first of all, two things. Number one is that this hadith you could see is actually not an authentic hadith. There's Sufyan ibn Waki' in that hadith. So this hadith is not authentic. But that the second, the inspiration that the scholars actually took from this non-authentic hadith is that the Prophet ﷺ quoted in a non-authentic quotation is that what this man had done, which basically this muhallim, what he had done was a very serious crime in where even the earth is not accepting him, in where that, we have even more evil people do crimes and they would still find burial, but that they were getting the inspiration that the earth did not want to embrace them even after their death for the crime that they had committed. Now, one thing is that as Muslims, we do recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said in the ayah, فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّمَاء وَالْأَرْض وَمَا كَانُوا مُنظَرِينَ. Not the skies and not the earth had cried over them. فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّمَاء. The skies did not cry over them. Wait a minute, skies actually cry. So when it's raining, it's actually crying? No. That's not what it's not necessarily crying, okay, when it's raining. But you could see that there are certain emotions that even the earth and even the skies and even the different things in nature, do recognize whether you are a pious person or not. So certainly you might be walking on earth and the earth knowing that you're a good person and it might actually caress you. But if it knows that you're an evil person, it might actually deal with you differently. Same thing when you're looking at maybe animals, you're looking at different things in nature that yes, there is a relationship. Do they actually know what I am? A tree, for example, was the Prophet there was a tree in the masjid, and the Prophet used to stand next to the tree to give the basically the orations and to speak right there. But then the Prophet needed and thought it would be a good idea to change the place where he stands. But then they heard the tree across the other area moaning. So here's the tree. Then they had to basically bring the tree. When the Prophet basically goes and puts his hand on the tree stops moaning.
Did the Sahaba hear the tree crying?
They did. The Sahaba, they did.
Subhanallah.
Yes, it was an authentic hadith that the Sahaba did actually hear the tree moaning. This is actually one of those miracles that you had a number of different Sahaba actually see it right before their eyes. So yes, the moaning of the tree, this was actually seen by a large number of Sahaba. They saw right in front of them that this tree is actually moaning. So it wasn't until the Prophet put his hand on the tree that the tree stopped moaning. Okay, so now what would make the tree moan? So even if you were to read Quran under a tree, the tree knows what you're doing. The tree feels what you're doing. The tree has emotions. In Islam, the tree has emotions. The tree has feelings. That's why you're not allowed to just cut off trees just for the sake of cutting off trees. You're not allowed to harm anything in nature just because of fun. No, you can't do that. Or even you're walking past, I don't know, a garden, you're like, here's a flower, and you start taking out the flowers. Unless you needed the flower, that's the only time, but not causing a fasad fil ard. These plants, these animals, the earth, the mountain, all of these things, they do feel and they do recognize what you're doing. And this is really scary, right?
Yeah, it is. SubhanAllah.
Yeah, it's really scary. It's really scary.
So are we allowed to pick flowers though?
That's the most important thing. Well, Noor, yes, you're allowed. Yes, you're allowed to take a.
I mean, mashallah, I like those flowers, so I just making sure.
Yes, you can actually take a flower only if you're using it for a good cause, not because you're just here, loves me not.
Oh, okay. Don't worry, I won't be doing
it. We're just making sure you're not taking it, love me not, love me not.
Inshallah.
Right. So
Are we
here's a
allowed to recite Quran on the dead, like at the
Can you
graveyard?
recite Quran on the dead in the graveyard? Fair enough. So number one is that when you look at reciting the Quran was actually sent to the people as a legislature, as a constitution, as basically as a revelation to the living people. But the question is, well, I wanted to recite the Quran in the graveyard, not for the sake of necessarily telling them at-talaqu marratan, divorce is twice, or whatever it is, and giving them the different rulings in Islam and reading Surah Nisa on them. But the reason why I wanted to read the Quran was really in order to, let's say, make this deed that I'm reciting the Quran in where my beloved parent, my beloved loved one would basically get the reward for the recitation. Scholars had differences of opinions on that. Not necessarily the Quran per se, the graveyard per se, but they had differences of opinions on whether the deed that you would do, on whether at all it can go for a deceased person. Why? Because there is a hadith where I want you to look at a number of different hadith and put that into why and how did they see these statements and how did they understand it and why did they understand it this way. So the first hadith is basically the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمَ إِذَا مَاتَ, let's see, إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمَ انقطع عمله إلا من ثلاث. انقطع عمله إلا من ثلاث. If the son of Adam basically dies, there are only one, is that all the different deeds, they're basically ending except in three things. Number one, he mentions that we're speaking about sadaqah jariyah. We're talking about a sadaqah jariyah. We're talking about a donation that it's still an ongoing donation. Number two, we're actually talking about ilm, where people are basically benefiting from it. Ilmun yantafi'u bihi an-nas. Here it is. People are benefiting from this science. People, hey, he made this research on stem cells, and this research on stem cells is bringing life to basically and hope to a lot of the people that are going through these diseases. Here we go. People are benefiting from this research. Yes, they are. Here we go. And number three, waladun salihun yad'u lah. And basically an offspring that's making dua for him. Now, this is one hadith. The other hadith, a woman comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, my mother made an oath that she would make Hajj, but she died before making it. Should I make Hajj on her behalf? And the Prophet ﷺ said, do you see if your mom had a debt that she owed, would you be the one to pay off the debt? And she said, yes. He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's debt is actually prior to the debt that people would basically have, or at least you owe to people. Number two, so here's the lady in where, of course, the Hajj, let's use the word Hajj to make the story short. Another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, Man kana alayhi siyam, and of course, they died, mat, sama anhu waliyu. If somebody dies and they had fasting to make up, then the person that is their guardian, the person that is basically living after them, would basically make up the fast. Let's say a mother had fasting to make up, but she died. Then in that, or a woman basically had fasting to make up and she died, then her husband would make up the fast. Oh, now this is a good deed and that's a good deed. So some scholars, they had considered that the good deeds and the bad deeds, once a person dies, that's basically the end of what is recorded on their actions. Other scholars, they said, well, except these points. Number one, Hajj if they had made an oath, or Siyam. So basically, it's exclusive to what we have evidence for that someone else can do on their behalf, or even good deeds like the ones that we had mentioned in the hadith. Some scholars, they regarded that, yes, it can be more inclusive to other deeds. Meaning what? I read Quran on my beloved one's behalf. And I said, Ya Allah, let my father get the reward for this. This is a dead person, not a living person. Because if it's a living person, you can't do a good deed on their behalf because they're alive. But we're talking about a dead person. I recited Quran and I said, Ya Allah, let this reward be on behalf of my deceased loved one. Then in that situation, will the reward go for them or not? The scholars that understood that, yes, in the general statement, it is permissible because you have other good deeds that can reach them. They said, here's our evidence. You've got some good deeds and it's not exclusive to these points, but it can be including other good deeds. The other scholars, they said, well, wait a minute, this is something that we have an evidence for to actually say that you can read Quran and basically give it to that person, and for that deceased person, you have no evidence for that. So the first group of those objecting scholars, they said, no, you're the one that's really getting the reward for this and not your loved one. But nice try, though. The second one will say, you're the one that got the reward, and this is not a nice try. Why not? The second group of scholars, they said, this is an innovation. How can you read Quran and you're basically doing a ibadah, a worship? This is not a nice try because you're doing a worship that you have no evidence to support it. Not nice try. What is the evidence that they actually considered? They considered that this is exclusive, that these hadith are exclusive to such particular actions, and you cannot do ibadah, but ibadah must have an evidence to support it. Any other way, any other ibadah that doesn't have any evidence to support it, then in that situation, it would be an innovation. What is the preponderant? Preponderant is you can read Quran or do certain a'mal salihah, certain good actions that are not bodily actions. So what does that mean? Like, you cannot pray on behalf of someone and say, well, yeah, my dad didn't used to pray, so I'm basically praying on his behalf. No, this is fard ayn. This is an obligation that he was supposed to do himself. What about Hajj? The Hajj is one, financial, is physical, and is also dhikr. That's different. If we took their money and used that money to do Hajj, even if, you know what, We didn't take their money. I wanted to invest myself and do Hajj on his behalf. That would be basically different, because Hajj is not a physical ibadah, but it's actually involving different areas of, let's call it, investment. All right. So what about Siyam? Siyam, they said, well, our objection is that Siyam, we've got an evidence where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, we'll stick to that text and that's it. We won't get in putting in other ibadat. Okay, so let's see, and let's see another one. Here's another question. I started reading the book Provisions of the Hereafter. It's amazing. It sure is. It sure is. Thank you for sharing. What should the person do to change the lifestyle that he was sucked in, like gambling, in regard to the previous lecture about prison statistics, that they are likely to go back to previous wrongdoings? Good question. I think what I had seen, you know, I enjoyed doing prison chaplaincy. Not always was I always capable of, I guess, going back to the inmates that I basically was working with when they were in prison. But I would say, number one, what would be helpful is looking at, number one, most people, they would go back to the crime or the sin that they were doing because of the environment that they were in. So if they go back to their previous friends, they go back to the previous city that they were in, they go back to that, they would easily get sucked in. So it's usually the influence of people that they had gotten so accustomed to. So changing the city, or changing, I guess, the environment and changing the city would be very helpful, because then you will find new people, you will find, along with the new people, I guess, new lessons to learn from, new behaviors, new things to get yourself accustomed to. So changing the country or changing the city or changing the place that you had committed the crime in would definitely be helpful. Changing your friends. If you're basically an introvert person.
Oh yeah, just like that. Just like the guy who killed 100 people.
Exactly. Just like the guy that killed 100 people. Changing the city is the start. Number two, working on changing the different habits, what actually got you into that. So if, let's say, a person has anger issues, okay, if you've got anger issues and that's what led to probably the major crime, maybe get yourself into some workout to get all the anger out. Work out and get the anger out, and probably don't put yourself into circumstances in where, if you know that you're a person that has anger issues and every time you're in business, you get so angry about business, then hey, maybe you need to find another job. All right. And the other thing is, if, for example, temptations, if this person is just so into, I guess the most thing that I had found in prisons, at least in women's prisons, is not necessarily anger issues. I think women that I had worked with in prisons, most of them were actually involved, one, in trafficking, two, in drugs, and not in consuming drugs, but in selling or being part of getting certain products. So they would go, for example, they would be given an instruction to go, for example, to CVS or Walgreens or whatever, and get like 20 packs of flu medication. And they would get these 20 packs of flu medication, and what it was going to be used, or cold medication, what it was going to be used for was really to cook meth. And that would basically be the assault, that they were actually involved in all of this. So there was a large group of women that were involved in this kind. And I actually had inmates that I worked with from Michigan, from Canada, from different parts of America, of course, different states, that were, most of them were actually involved in that. So they would basically buy these substances, and they would be dragged in it, either by their brother or by a friend, or of course they're told, hey, it's going to be a business, it's going to be making you money, etc. So not really in killing. Only one person or two people actually, was it two? I think two people were actually involved in killing. One of them killed her own child, and the other one,
Ya Allah.
yeah, you'll see horrors in prisons. One of them killed her own child, and usually these people would have these anger issues. And the other one killed her ex-boyfriend, basically because she said that he had assaulted her, but then she basically retaliated. But you can't take the law in your own hands. So she was basically, of course, she was supposed to report that rather than go and take the law in her own hands. So that's when she had actually killed him. Very few cases. One case, that one was really strange. So this woman basically does, this is so weird. This woman actually says that she's involved in jihad, ironically, and starts killing non-Muslims and gets caught. And this woman actually has ISIS thought, and she's acting like this. I really think she, I really think it's a strange case, because she was new Muslim. She was a new Muslim. And who knows how she misunderstood Islam, where she got her ideas from. She definitely was reading from the wrong sources, and basically was charged 25 years in prison and with no parole. All right. And she was actually in one of the most dangerous in Winona. What was it? Winona? What was it? Winona, was it?
I think she read Surah At-Tawbah.
I don't know. There was another really sad situation. That girl was actually Somali. I really found it really sad, and I think that the court was really not fair with her. So let me tell you what happened. So this girl basically says she wants to do jihad, and goes and basically sets a daycare on fire. This was real. Sets a daycare on fire, and of course she's caught. And this girl was actually in medical school, mind you. She was a really smart girl, really smart girl. It's really sad. It's really sad, because when I actually talked to her, and I was going to her a couple times, this girl was obviously going through mental illness. She was actually believing that she was spoken to by God, and that she had some jihad mission and all of that. So, you could see that she believed that she was Mahdi, and she was ordered to do some form of jihad. I mean, this is right in the boldest words, really speaking of a person that is going through some kind of a paranoia, along with, of course, what's it called, when they start speaking to themselves. Right now, can't remember the word, or at least they're hearing voices. What is that called, Nura? Well, no, it's
Schizophrenia.
Psychosis. No, it's psychosis. Because she was telling me that she was hearing voices talk to her and tell her that she has to do this, and she thought it was basically the malaika telling her that. So she was definitely going through psychosis. I don't really know always. I can't really follow all the different cases and because most of them were going through trial. So I don't usually have the time to, I guess, follow the cases, because some of those cases would actually take years to know what the final trial was. But this girl actually was clearly going through some form of psychosis, but she was really treated horribly, to be honest. she was treated horribly. She was coming in every single time I would talk to her. Her hands were handcuffed and tightly handcuffed. Her legs were handcuffed. And when I'm talking about handcuffed, we're not just talking about handcuffed. Even her legs were chained. Her hands were chained. She was not allowed to wear the hijab. Alhamdulillah, I managed to actually talk to the coordinators and give her the chance to wear hijab. She wanted to wear a niqab, but then of course, with all that situation, she was not looking pretty good in terms of even the way that she was not cooperating was making her also lose a lot of her rights in terms of, I guess, getting her religious, getting her religious, I guess, choices being tolerated. So yeah, so that's a different case. But I don't know how I got into this. How did we get from graveyards to prisons? Jumping from
I don't know. Let's get back to it. Yalla.
Back to it. Exactly. Now it's at 1:52. Back to it. I guess I should say it's all your fault. Now this is basically, getting it out of my, where do we go? All right. So yeah, we actually got there because of this hadith, and the sister was wondering, like, wait a minute, how can the earth actually get us not accepted? Let's look at this hadith right there. This is hadith on Umar ibn Hussein, that the Prophet ﷺ had sent off an army, basically a Muslim army, to some mushrikeen, basically some combatants of non-Muslim combatants, and they basically did, let's call it a strong fight. But فَمَنَحُوهُمْ أَكْافًا. What happened was that they actually surrendered. But then one man from his people basically had said La ilaha illallah. But then one of the Muslim guys, when this guy said Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, I am Muslim, but despite that, this Muslim guy, he still killed him. So he came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, I'm kind of like halakt, which really means I'm doomed. And he said, what did you do? He said it twice and 3 times, and where I'm doomed. He said, what did you do? So he told the Prophet ﷺ what he had done. So he basically said, well, it's like, he said it in the most obvious words. Why not do what? It doesn't mean, well, maybe he should have just opened up his belly. This doesn't mean that in that word, but it's kind of like, it's a reprimandment really to tell him, it's like, what more do you want? It's kind of like saying, what more do you want? But the guy took it literally. And he said, oh, Prophet of Allah, if I were to cut up his belly, would I actually know what's in his heart? He said, no. But you didn't even accept what he had confessed and what he had actually said. And you didn't even know what was in his heart. In other words, you still assaulted, you still killed the guy. And the Prophet ﷺ basically stayed quiet. He was absolutely angry at what happened. And of course, it wasn't until some while that he basically, that man basically died, and basically the same story happened. So it seems like there are a number of different stories to what really had happened. Let's see. Let's end right here because we can go in more details in regards to this ayah. You could see, what page are we on right here? 48. I had actually prepared until page 90. But inshallah, we will continue tomorrow because we've got a very, very, very beautiful page. Well, I mean, all the pages are beautiful, but tomorrow, I guess it's taking us into something else, not killing at all.
Oh,
I know
please, that killing,
Oh, I know. As women, we just can't handle the word killing. It's like, oh, kill. We've been talking about this for a couple of days, and now it's like, oh, I don't want to hear any information about that. But no, tomorrow, inshallah, it's going to be different because it's going to be talking about something where, let's say, heart softening. Inshallah. Let's call it
Inshallah.
heart. Yeah, inshallah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. But one thing is that you want to keep in mind that Islam and the Quran, I know we're like, oh, I don't like the word killing. Alhamdulillah, if you don't like the word kill and killing, that's actually a good sign that you are on the fitrah, that you're on the pure instinct. Even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. He said you were obligated to basically fight, that is in combat, in jihad, and it is hated upon you. In other words, if we're talking about it is hated upon us, meaning it is not something that we would like, that we like, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we're speaking about it, it's really to lay out the different rulings, to lay out the different circumstances, because we understand that justice could only be protected by power. If you want to protect justice, you have to have the power, the law enforcement to protect what is considered as the most sanctuary thing after deen, which is the human life. So when we speak about all of this, why are we talking about killing? Definitely not because we enjoy killing, but because we're talking about the sanctity of human life. We're talking about the most important thing in understanding justice. Human life is the foundation of justice. The understanding its sanctity is basically the start of understanding justice. So when we're speaking about that, it's because we're speaking about the importance of human life, the importance of justice. So inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow, inshallah. And Rabbi yahfadhkum jami'an. I'm so happy to see everyone, and we'll stop the recording here. And yeah.